Hello, my name is Dr. Brian Plato, and I'll be talking to you today about identifying migraine triggers and dietary changes that may be able to help better manage migraine. So first, as we've previously talked about, is understanding that individuals who have migraine have a brain that is more sensitive to external factors. And what I mean when I say that is changes in the environment, changes in weather, changes in things that are around us. The brain of an individual with migraine is more sensitive to these changes and more likely to develop a migraine attack when one of these changes comes about. So when talking about migraine triggers, those that are most commonly reported by patients include things such as stress, menstruation, changes in sleep, skipping meals, changes in weather, diet, things such as alcohol. And we'll talk about the fact that many times these triggers can be very difficult to identify a single trigger as perhaps the cause for a migraine attack. Part of the reason for that is the effect of that trigger can be delayed. So you may have exposure to a trigger and it takes 24 or 48 hours before the migraine attack develops. It's hard for us to think of all of the things that we have done in the preceding 24 to 48 hours that might impact us developing migraine. The other, and I'll show a slide on this in a second, is the summation of migraine triggers. And so what I mean by that is, for many individuals, it is the combining of trigger A plus trigger B plus trigger C is what gives us migraine. So for example, this week you get a bad night of sleep, there's a weather pattern change that happens, and then you have a glass of red wine. Boom, migraine. But let's say next week you don't have any weather pattern changes, sleep great, and you have a glass of red wine and you don't get a migraine attack. And then you say to yourself, well, I don't know whether this is a trigger or is not a trigger, because one time I have a glass of wine and I get a migraine, and then the next week I don't. And so this is why it can be very difficult to identify some of those triggers unless you have a single trigger that is so significant that every time that you get a migraine attack, or every time that you're exposed to that trigger, it results in a migraine attack. So this is a picture of what I was sort of describing to you. So what we have is the red line that you're seeing is the so-called threshold. So this is the amount that your triggers have to exceed in order to trigger a migraine attack. So on the left here, we have a situation where the triggers are low. That's the sort of brown colored area. And they're lower than the threshold. And so you don't get a migraine attack. But then let's say the next individual here, they have a lower threshold, subjected to the same amount of triggers, and then they get a migraine attack. Now, back to our first individual that has that higher threshold, it takes more triggers for them to end up having a migraine attack. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we see the situation where we have a very high threshold. So this individual's threshold for migraine is high enough that they can be subjected to a high number of triggers and still not get a migraine attack. And so there are several factors that go into why individuals have a difference in their threshold for migraine. So some of us, it's unfortunately genetic. Sometimes it can be due to head trauma or prior infections or whatever reason that may result in us having a lower threshold for migraine triggers. And so it takes less for us to cross over. And then there's some people who have a higher threshold for migraine. So it takes a lot for them to get that trigger. and also preventive medicines, which have been talked about in other sessions. So the goal of using preventive medicines is to raise that threshold so that it takes more triggers for us to result in a migraine attack. So let's look at some specific triggers. So there are things that are modifiable, and then there are things that are non-modifiable in terms of migraine triggers. So things that are modifiable, maybe stress, sometimes sleep, diet, so things like alcohol, caffeine, missing meals, a lot of preservatives in food, the amount of water intake, the amount of exercise that we're getting, our use of technology and screens. There are things that are non-modifiable. You know, I wish I could predict and affect and change the weather, but I can't. Things like sunlight coming in to your eyes, certain odors that you might be exposed to, you know, walking through the mall and you're exposed to a strong scent or something of that nature. In many cases, hormones for females or other coexistent medical conditions. So talking about stress, this is one of the triggers that my patients and I are talking about quite frequently. Very important. We all have stress in our lives. Different people have different degrees of stress, and all of us manage stress differently. And I would also encourage you to not underestimate the so-called letdown. So this is the, you know, Monday through Friday, you're going, and then Saturday, crash. And then there's that crash migraine on the weekend that happens. Or vacations, this is a big one. Or I see this, you know, let's say in students that they've got finals, they get all the way through finals, and then boom, they, you know, have that that sort of crash migraine. So being aware of both when stress is perhaps affecting us, so that then you can maybe work on some of the other modifiable triggers, so getting good sleep, taking care of yourself nutritionally, getting good exercise, but then also being aware of these so-called letdown. Sleep. So this is hugely important for treating migraine. So as individuals have more sleep fragmentation, it leads to the chronification of migraine. And it's not just the quantity, but also the quality. And then oversleeping can sometimes be just as bad as undersleeping. So, you know, with that letdown I just talked about a moment ago, not only do you maybe have that letdown on Saturday morning, but also the oversleep. And so, you know, that factored in together may result in breakthrough migraine. So looking at ways to improve sleep. So think about having a fixed bedtime and awakening time. Try not to nap. Avoid alcohol before bed. Avoid caffeine before bed. Avoid foods that are sugary, spicy, or heavy foods. Get regular exercise. Have your sleeping environment be comfortable and cool. And use your bedroom for sleep. I know a lot of us are, you know, working from home and trying to be flexible, but your bedroom really should be the place where you sleep, not work, you know, not watch TV, not the hangout spot. Maybe try a little snack, warm milk. Work on sort of the kind of time to let your mind ease down, that worry period before going to bed. Get a pre-bed routine. And if you're not falling asleep, don't just lay there and stew about it. Get back up, do something, read, and then get back into bed. And if you have a TV in your bedroom, take it out today. Don't have the screens, the phone, the iPad, etc., in bed with you. So dietary changes. So there are different dietary triggers for everyone with migraine. It's sometimes difficult to adhere to these strict dietary suggestions. I would say overall this should be part of your plan. And I would really encourage avoiding the skipping of meals. Okay, so these fluctuations in blood sugar may result in headache. So we want to eat regular small meals throughout the course of the day. Drink plenty of water, 2 or 3 liters a day is what I suggest. And try to avoid a lot of preservatives and chemicals in your diet. Migraine and obesity are linked together. Obese individuals are more likely to have chronic migraine. There's not clear evidence on whether bariatric surgery or certain weight loss diets result in improving migraine. What about fasting? So with fasting, individuals are more likely to have breakthrough migraine. So certain religious practices involve fasting with their traditions, and you can see that during times of fasting, there are more likely to develop headaches. So be mindful of periods of time where you may need to be fasting. Some problems with gluten-related dietary changes. So people can have celiac disease, which is an autoimmune gluten sensitivity. They can have an allergic gluten sensitivity, or they can have just a gluten sensitivity that is not allergic and not autoimmune. They can have other symptoms like GI symptoms of diarrhea, bloating, other problems. So individuals that have gluten sensitivity are more likely to have migraine. Migraine is more prevalent in individuals who have celiac disease than in the general population. Not really clear why. And so, if there are patients who I'm seeing that have migraine and coexistent GI symptoms, I may bring up the idea of looking at the practicality of a gluten-free diet. MSG is a commonly cited trigger. It does have a unique taste associated with it. It's considered a natural substance. It can be tricky sometimes to find this on labeling. So, things that you might, think about are, that have high glutamate content, or like Parmesan cheese, soy sauce, tomato juice, things of that nature. Not necessarily always labeled on packaging. Sometimes can just be called natural flavors. So this is a tricky one, many times hidden in our foods. Here's some examples that you might find MSG in: Chinese foods, soups, seasoned foods, frozen, processed meats. Be careful of leftovers. As they go longer, they can increase in their tyramine content, especially if it's not stored in a proper fashion, or foods that are left out at parties, things like that. You may be more likely to trigger migraine. Alcohol. This is a big one that gets talked about a lot. Red wine is probably the one that gets talked about the most, and distilled vodka is probably the least. People who have migraine are going to be more susceptible to hangovers. Alcohol can lead to dehydration, which may be a trigger for migraine. So, be careful when drinking alcohol. Other substances like nitrates and nitrites are preservatives. They can have vasodilatory effects. These are found in a lot of our, sort of processed and packaged meats. Artificial sweeteners, this sort of depends on the individual. Just sort of be careful with a lot of these. Caffeine. So caffeine sort of is a bit of a, let's say, love-hate relationship with migraine. So it can be found in a lot of migraine medications. So for example, Excedrin maybe helps these medications to be more effective. But at the same time, when consumed frequently, can lead to more headache, the idea of rebound or medication overuse headache. And when people are consuming caffeine at high doses for extended periods of time, suddenly stopping that might lead to caffeine withdrawal and increased headache. So one is check your medicines and see how much caffeine you're getting from some of your medicines. Abrupt withdrawal of caffeine may lead to more headache, so you want to sort of slowly wean that down. Some people say 0 caffeine. I'm generally saying about 100 milligrams a day is okay. So what does 100 milligrams look like? So here's some examples. So soda, between 30 and 50 milligrams. 6-ounce home brewed coffee is right at about 100 milligrams. Decaf is very minimal. Tea is pretty minimal. And sorry to all of those who have their morning Starbucks fix, but really getting a lot of caffeine there with their coffee. Talked a bit about alcohol. So, patients are more likely to have a migraine-like headache following alcohol, but not necessarily other hangover symptoms. Small levels of alcohol may not necessarily increase the frequency of migraine attacks unless paired with stress. As I mentioned earlier, red wine compared with vodka may be more likely to trigger migraine attacks. So, if you are going to choose to drink alcohol, which is fine, maybe go with something, like a vodka-based drink rather than, stronger red wine. Chocolate is a tricky one. So people think about this all the time as a trigger for migraine, but this is debatable. So as you've learned about here today in sort of understanding what migraine is, we've talked about some of the premonitory symptoms associated with migraine. And one of those premonitory symptoms of migraine might be the craving of certain sweet foods. And chocolate is one of those most abundantly available sweets. And so you're having the premonitory effects of migraine. You're craving something sweet. Eat some chocolate. Develop migraine. Natural thought is going to be, oh, I got this migraine because I ate chocolate. When in all actuality, maybe the migraine attack was going to develop no matter what. And it just so happens that the chocolate was eaten because of those premonitory symptoms. And then as a consequence, the migraine comes about when maybe it was just going to develop anyways. But then there may be some chemicals in chocolate that can lead to headache. So, this is one that I don't think you necessarily need to go raid your house and throw away all the chocolate right now. So there's a lot of others. Some things that might affect you may not affect someone else. Some things that affect someone may not affect you. And so, things that you might want to think about is, just sort of evaluating if you notice you're having more migraine when you're eating certain foods. But as I talked about, missing meals or dieting can result in low blood sugar, fluctuations in blood sugar, and dehydration. So these are all things that we want to be avoiding. So here's a plan of attack. So eating frequent small meals throughout the day to sort of stabilize that blood sugar throughout the day, really pushing the fluids, okay? So I really try to talk to my patients about getting 2 to 3 liters of water per day. And some people may be interested in an elimination diet where they sort of take away all of these potential triggers and then slowly reintroduce them. So thinking about some diets that might be helpful. So one was they removed all the thoughts of, or all of the foods that are thought to be triggers for migraine. And the other was that they ate all of those foods and they both got better. So the reality is that probably that schedule of being on regular, regularly scheduled meals, those are the things that may be helpful. So water. So again, I suggest this to all my patients. There's nothing that's cheaper. There's nothing that has fewer. So in those with less than 2.5 liters of water consumption per day, simply increasing water consumption by 1.5 liters didn't necessarily improve headache frequency, but improved benefit and their migraine-specific quality of life questionnaire. So eliminating, I talked about this briefly, so sort of taking away all of these potential foods that might trigger migraine, and then sort of slowly, one at a time, reintroducing them and keeping a headache journal will be helpful in identifying maybe there is something that really is playing a role in triggering your migraine attacks. So the takeaway would be, maybe pay more attention to your overall diet rather than a specific dietary, plan. Sort of eating more, real whole foods, sticking with a regular food schedule, getting plenty of water. Those would really be, the things to highlight. Exercise. So getting moderate exercise 3 to 5 times a week. So, we generally want about 150 minutes a week of exercise. But for some people, that can't be things like running and biking. I'm big on yoga, and I encourage my patients to use YouTube as a potential source of classes for exercises and routines for YouTube. Some other triggers, so technology. So I talked about those bright screens late at night, and some patients have trouble with some of the motion on the screens being a trigger for them as well. Weather, this is tough. I would say in our practice, absolutely, if you just based it on the number of patients that call in, when they're calling in, that weather pattern changes definitely can be a big trigger for migraine. I don't know that there's much to do about it. I'm not using this as an endorsement, but I'm just saying that some of my patients have looked up a specific product called Migraine X on Amazon and have told me that they feel like it is helpful. That maybe is something that you might look into. In terms of other things, so sunlight, not necessarily sunglasses that have dark tints to them. So there's this idea of the so-called matinee effect. So we'll get a lot of patients that, come in wearing sunglasses all the time. And if you are constantly blocking bright light from coming in, then when you are exposed to light, think of, again, with that matinee effect, when you go to a movie in the middle of the day and then you come out, all that bright sunlight, when it hits your eyes, really has an effect. So we don't necessarily want to encourage wearing sunglasses all the time. There may be a couple brands that I think are worth looking at. So these Axon Optics and Theraspecs, I think might be a good choice. Some of my patients really find those to be a good fit for them. Odors, strong perfumes. This can be tricky, right? You go to church and sit down, and someone who comes and sits down next to you has some strong odors on. That not necessarily something you can always control. I do encourage really being honest with people in your life. So, if you have a coworker who you're finding has strong perfumes, or a family member or someone, just being honest about how it has an effect on you may help them to tone it down a bit, and so that it's not such a big trigger for you. Things like high altitude, loud noises, not always things that can be controllable. Hormones. So obviously migraine affects females more than males. Drops in estrogen can trigger that. It's not quite as easy as it might seem to necessarily control the effects of estrogen on migraine. Other medical conditions, so the side effects of certain medications, having heart disease, dialysis, coexistent depression, anxiety, temporomandibular dysfunction, head injury, all of these having effects on migraine as a trigger. So here's some habits that you might look at. So eating regularly, maintaining a healthy weight, quitting smoking, exercising regularly but gently, practicing relaxation, getting enough sleep but not too much. Think about things like physical therapy, acupuncture, biofeedback, massage. And so it's not necessarily a single migraine trigger, but the summation of multiple triggers. Try keeping track of some of those big triggers when you're getting frequent headaches. And then the most important thing that I can highlight is the impact of sleep, stress reduction and management, and drinking plenty of water. So thanks for joining me today. I hope to see you all again in person at next year's Expo. But I hope that this information was useful, and have a great day.